You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're sharing part 2 of our discussion with Jim Kumon. We chat about the challenges of development, how to crowdfund a building, coming to the end of an 80-year economic cycle, and how more information can make it harder to learn new things. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. And now, let's get back to the show. I wonder, how do you teach development? What's the process like if somebody wants to do more missing middle housing or focus on certain types of housing that don't get a lot of attention? Like, how do we build that capacity? How do you teach quote unquote development?
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's in school.
No, God, no. I got to work for 6 years, basically being a remedial college course for professionals, frankly, because that's kind of what half of IncDev turned into, was teaching people who dealt with real estate every day in their jobs, planners, economic development, housing, now, DEI type stuff, redevelopment agencies, right? These are the people who showed up at a lot of the early IncDev classes. We were out there trying to teach developers. And guess who showed up and paid $200 to come to the course? People who were trying to help developers of all scales and literally couldn't tell you anything hardly about the basic fundamentals of how it worked. And you're like, well, no wonder we can't have nice things. The people we've put in charge of making those nice things never got taught what a nice thing was and how to get it. And so we actually adjusted some of our curriculum as we went a couple of years in to try to be inclusive of people that we knew were going to come to these classes who would never actually be a developer themselves, but were highly influential to try to help make the rules or the money or the land or whatever work better in their community. And so that ecosystem piece lives on in our work at neighborhood evolution as well, because it's such a team sport. Right. The neighborhood evolution, Monty Anderson, he kind of made the 12-step process. Monty is a person, he self-described, like, I'm a simple man, right? He's like, I need to see a path. I have to repeat that path. He's not doing light tech projects. He's not doing crazy, like he just does these really straightforward, but incredibly complicated, right? They're not complicated financially. They're complicated because he's tackling all these things that don't fall into single family houses, massive multifamily shopping malls, right? The places where conventional capital lives, right? It's not any of those projects, right? Even Main Street projects are very hard because there's no, mortgage-backed security, right, for Main Street, mixed-use buildings. If there was, we probably see a lot more of them. And so that's, I think, the other reality of this educational process is that people thought money was money. It's like, well, no, money is a whole lot of different things. And without money, you don't get real estate projects. And so I think that was probably the thing that we had to spend the most amount of time unpacking, how to explain to people how money worked. Our built environment is a production of an outcome of the way that we structured capital. And so we keep getting the same thing because the money keeps being set up to do the same thing.
Is it that the banks tell you what money is and you have to pay attention to what they tell you?
Well,
I've heard these stories about, parking requirements and stuff, and those things come from the banks, not necessarily, regulations and codes and stuff like that. So
certainly. Well, there's this whole suburban experiment thing that we did for the last 75 years, which also highly subsidized a certain way of a certain pattern of development. And with that, the economic and the banking system figured out a way to fund that process, right, of building large-scale developments with monocultures of product types, right? Whether it was commercial, industrial, or residential, right? We got really good at building monocultures. Neighborhood building, right? Development at the lot and block level is not a monoculture, right? It's the Amazon instead. And so you're in part, and the thing about small development and incremental development, so incremental development is a lot of times taking bigger things and breaking them down so that we can use them. One of the biggest challenges we face now for the next couple decades, while you and I are still kicking around making decisions in this profession, is we're stuck with the built environment we have, right? We can decide that we think, Strodes are crappy and downtown office towers should be converted to residential, but it ain't that easy. And so what's going to be interesting to see what happens is, as we see a massive contraction in, the commercial, especially the class B and C commercial office spaces, is the finance that's attached to it all. Someone's going to lose a lot of money. Lots of people are going to lose lots of money when these one-time use buildings that we created for decades are at the end and past the end of their expiration date. What do you do with a building that's 10, 15, 50,000 square feet that has almost no value, whether it's a retail center or a flash cube office building from the 70s? No one will lease it, and therefore it has no value, and therefore it has no taxable assessment, which means we have a hole in our city budget, right? That cascade hurts everybody in a hurry, right? It takes a couple of years, right, to reassess these things and so forth. But it's a problem we're going to have to work together to solve. And going back to the initial question about, well, do banks make these decisions? Well, yes, but they're also bound by government regulation, right? They have to do certain things to keep their balance sheets flexible and to cover losses and so forth. So we are at a epic, right? Like we're at an inflection point in our nation's economy, right? A good friend, Johnny Sanfilippo, fellow San Franciscan there, his blog, Granola Shotgun, one of my favorites. One of his early blog posts was talking about how systems rise and fall, right? How economies rise and fall. And so humanity has a pretty good cycle about every 70 to 80 years where we flip a switch and something serious happens, whether it's the Industrial Revolution to things that happened around post-Civil War and the railroads, and then World War II and suburbia. And we're kind of running on the fumes of that last 80-year cycle, right? We're kind of past due. And now the pandemic and other things that have changed about we're into a new cycle. We don't really know what that is yet, but we're definitely, I think the pandemic, was the final nail in whatever was the previous era's coffin, right? Like we are into the great unknown, still believing that we're using the same rules, the same financing, right, as the old system. And the takeaway that Johnny always pointed out, and this is something he just saw as he looked at these things and he read other people making the same observations, was that the old system doesn't decide it's going to change itself. A new system arises and the old system becomes obsolete, right? People didn't come back from World War II thinking, let's go move out of the city and check out the suburbs that don't exist yet. And we're going to move billions of dollars of capital out of the places that we've lived in and worked in for our entire lives. And we're going to go do this someplace else now, right? That wasn't the plan. We set up a set of rules and finance where that became possible. And in some cases, the only logical choice. So we don't know what that next system is going to look like yet, but it's probably going to be pretty influenced by, crazy weather patterns and a collapsing insurance market and a lot more. Speaking of funding, right, the Fed basically stamping out the idea of making money on interest for about a decade, has trained a whole era. That's one of the biggest issues right now with the people that we've trained in real estate for the last 10 years is that everybody knew nothing but 3% and 4% interest rates. Now they're 8%, right? No one's performance work anymore, right? It's like one thing. And then the old timers, the people who lived through the savings and loan crisis in the 80s and, picked the previous, crisis, we're like, I remember when it was 12% interest rates and we had to make these projects work. You youngins, haven't seen nothing, right? And it's like, but it gives you perspective that this isn't a new problem, but it is, when you have a federal monetary policy that decides that money is going to be basically free, for the better or worse for more than a decade, it distorts your economy. It does some weird stuff. And then, the current problem we have with inflation is really problematic because we desperately need more housing. And the brute force tool that we're using to try to control inflation is interest rates, which multiplicatively negatively affects building more housing. And because we're not building enough housing, we're seeing rental rates rise. Yeah. And that's actually making the inflation worse. And you're like, this is a death cycle. This is why systems fail, because we can't figure out how to decouple these problems. So in some ways, building small and educating people about building small is being able to recognize that this is the industry that you're a part of, right? The real estate industry is by definition a cycle. The attributes of that cycle change. And the goal is to figure out how you respond and fit in and do projects within whatever economic cycle that you are in. And people make lots of money in downturns in real estate, right? Because they buy something that's highly undervalued and they make it valuable again. So it's not that you can't do work in this day and age of higher interest rates. It's just that you can't do what you did 5 years ago. And that's the thing. Like there's so much creativity involved, and that's not for everybody, right? And especially hard for the governments to keep up because they're not nimble to begin with. And they have TIF programs and free land, and they have all these tools. And then the tools just, unfortunately, they just keep rolling them forward, right? Well, we had this before, it worked. And well, why is no one applying for our projects, our programs anymore? Because your tools don't solve the problem we have today. They solve the problem we had 5 years ago. So there's a catch-up process that happens. And so even people who are trying to help don't know how to help because they didn't know how the performer worked to begin with. So real estate education in the kind of work that we're trying to do at the neighborhood scale is difficult because you're constantly A, in this macro cycle, but B, you're doing things with money and rules and so forth that aren't even well rewarded in the macro cycle. You're always kind of counter cycle to it. And so it requires you to teach people to do things that are like almost counter to every real estate blog or Bigger Pocket, like any of these types of like, go read about how this should work. And it's like, yeah, but that's not going to work here. And I think the biggest part about our work that with neighborhood evolution or whatnot is that people are the solution at that point, right? I can teach you about performance all day. I can teach you how to read your zoning code. I can teach you how to draw a site plan. I can teach you these technical skills, right? And they'll get you to a certain point. But at the end of the day, a community has to decide whether it wants more housing or not, whether it wants to make Main Street buildings that an entrepreneur can buy and own and build wealth in. A community has to figure this out because every community has the tools to make a real estate project happen. And it has the tools to make those properties more valuable and easier to get to by making good transportation choices and about what we put in our right of ways, how safe it is to step off the curb into a street, and not be run down by a vehicle. Like we have the choices, we can make these choices. So the ability to educate people about, why we're here 20 years later. I mean, you and I started going to CNU, trying to learn about why we shouldn't have vehicle lanes that are too wide because they kill people, right? Because people drive too fast. And yet, what am I doing 20 years later? I'm still project by project, I'm coaching small developers how to deal with their public works departments who will not allow us to put on-street parking in front of their retail. And you're like, do we have to fight this battle one parking space at a time across the entirety of America, right? This is why we can't have nice things. So I think it started with education because unless we understand the things that are preventing us from getting to the place we seemingly agree we want to get to, we can't make these community decisions to fix them. So I feel like it's good that we've gotten to this point because at least now we're having a conversation. So many of these things are at least on the table, even if we're still not making the decisions to change them yet.
Yeah. There's so many interesting things to talk about from that. I mean, the insurance stuff I've been noodling on as well. The inflation stuff is really interesting, especially since housing's driving inflation. And so it's not all the other things. It's basically housing. And then housing, it's like a self-perpetuating circle. But I want to talk a little bit too about, and I'm sure we'll get to this in future times, but I want to talk a little bit about how you and Faith are doing something a little bit interesting and different in terms of like crowdfunding a project. Because I think that, talking about finance, talking about thinking about how to do things a little bit differently, how it's not, it's not going to fit into any of those models necessarily, but it does fit into this kind of thing that's been happening over the last, 10, 15 years or so with this idea of people, helping to build something together.
Yeah. Speaking of like full circle as a society, right? When immigrants came to this country and built things, right? They didn't have 30-year mortgages or such tools, right? Unless they came here in the last 40, 50, 60 years. And even up until 1970, even those tools weren't, available to anybody who wasn't basically white male and had a job. So even then it was still a pretty closed door activity to get the lowest rung of financing to happen. And So the tool that you're talking about that is related to a project that we're trying to put together like right now is we are in the process of doing what is called Regulation CF, Regulation Crowdfunding. It is an SEC approved way to basically syndicate money for a business transaction, or in this case for real estate. And it was kind of reborn about 10 years ago now, and went through a couple of iterations through the Obama administration, and then was revised in the last couple of years again to make the rules work better. There was a learning curve. The SEC's job is to make sure that regular consumers don't get ripped off. Right? That's kind of their role. And if you have lots of money and you're willing to risk it to do something and you lose it all, well, you knew better, right? Like you had lots of money, you got that somehow, and you probably should have an ability to calculate risk as a result. And so the challenge with that is that you have to have an annual income of $250,000 and net worth of, many times more than that to play in the game, right? And so when you're involved in a real estate transaction of anything more than a couple units, you're talking to rich people. Like they're the only ones even technically really allowed to even be talked to, right? To raise money. I had to put together the total capital was $500,000 or $600,000. Some of it was mine, some of it came from investors. And so when you are forced by regulation to only talk to people with that kind of capital, you're talking to a very specific sliver of your community and your world. And so the crowdfunding rules were kind of meant to be able to allow a wider range of people to invest in businesses and then also in real estate. And so the rules allow for folks, anyone can invest into a regulation crowdfunding offering that's at least $2,500. That's like the household, minimum, regardless of what you do. If you make above $124,000 a year as a household and have more than $124,000 of net worth, so if you have some retirement savings, you have whatever, anything that's not your actual house of residence, that doesn't count, but anything more than that. So again, if you're 20 something and have a lot of student debt, you're going to be doing the minimum. If you're dual income, in your 40s and beyond, and, have something of savings, in your portfolio, like you can play a little more in the game. So we've opened a crowdfunding campaign for a duplex with a carriage house on one lot. We're going to try to make it a passive house project, the duplex in particular. And we are crowdfunding through a platform called Common Owner. And we're trying to raise about $200,000 through the crowdfunding mechanism. And most of the folks who were in a phase called testing the waters, and that is a new thing that they did about 2 years ago in the latest rule changes that allow you to talk to people about your potential project before you spend a couple $1,000s making an actual honest to goodness blessed offering, and find out you had the wrong terms, you had too low interest rate, you had a product no one can understand, right? And then you're done because you can't fix that. So we've had a lot of great conversations being able to use this testing the water phase to, if I could, would you type of conversation. And so we have verbal commitments of around $100,000 and we're trying to get to, twice that. So we've been doing it maybe 2 months now. So that's pretty quick for the world of fundraising, like to kind of get halfway to your goal from a standing still start. But it is mostly people interested in doing investments between $5,000 and $10,000. Right. So if I'm raising $200,000, I got to find, 20 to 40 people, depending on how much everyone puts in. So that's kind of doable. Right. And the cost of construction is that, it's still not a small project. It's going to be $1.5 million to build a duplex with a unit out back over a garage. Right. It's speaking of the old barn raising, that would have been a hell of a lot cheaper if we could just all get together. If the 40 people that was going to give me money could basically order a bunch of wood and go spend 3 or 4 days just putting it up ourselves and wiring it and putting the roof on, we could be done a hell of a lot quicker for less money. I tell you, we could.
Yeah.
And so that's the weird part, right, of where we are at, right? My father, I'm the third child as well, speaking of that from the beginning of the podcast, and we have very long generation in my family. And so my dad was the third child basically and came along much later. And so my grandfather, his father, was born in the 1890s. That's how long our generations are. And so in the 30s and 40s, he was a brick mason working at the Ford plant in Detroit, Dearborn actually. And he built and renovated things on the weekends, right? It's Polish, hardworking Polish immigrants, right? Work in the factory, make a good living, and then on the side, flip houses basically. And so he was a mason. So what they would do is they would go and lift up these old wooden rickety houses that were built in the 1890s in the center part of Detroit and Hamtramck, where my dad was born, and prop these things up and like make them sturdier, right? Because they were kind of rickety after 30 or 40 years. And they'd, fix them up a little bit and they'd flip them. But post-war, right, materials were shortage, right? You couldn't get roofing, you couldn't get these things. And so my dad would tell me stories as he's a young kid. He was born in 1938 of, this post-war era where people just got together on the weekends and poured a driveway for Joe. You hear about these anecdotes. It's like, no, these things actually happened. There was no home builder you're going to show up to build the post-war housing. Like that came out later, but the first 5 years after the war, it was just a free for all, right? Like a good chunk of the first ring suburbs, in our country were built just however with the barn raising thought process. So it's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, okay, so I come from a family, both my father and my mother grew up for significant portions of their childhood in duplexes. Okay. And I didn't even realize this until I was like 18 years old. Like I just thought Clara was the lady who lived upstairs at my grandma's house. I didn't understand that she owned that. And that was like, I lived in the hinterlands. I lived in a single family house in a suburb that, or beyond a suburb. And I didn't understand what that meant in urbanistic terms. And so I realize now that I'm like of a lineage of people who've lived in urbanism and duplexes and other things in big cities. My wife is as well, in a sense. My kids will be sixth generation living in Minneapolis through her lineage. But you have to pause when I'm out here pitching money, right? I'm talking about raising money so I can build something that's $1.5 million in value. And you're like, I'm just building a duplex.
So much work to just build a duplex, right?
So much work just to build a duplex, right? And so I'm out here talking to people about like, okay, what's accessible to us, right? And it's going to take me talking to 40 friends and strangers to make a couple $100,000 appear in the pot and then try to get a loan and then try to build this thing. And it's like, well, no wonder there was only 15 of those things getting built for the last 4 or 5 years after we changed the rules. Because like, I'm sure it could be done a little cheaper than what I'm doing it. And I bought some very expensive land and there's like 2 vacant lots in the neighborhood, where my kids go to school, right? Because we're in the part of town that doesn't have any of those things. And so certainly it could be done for less than that, but it's an example of why it is hard to get the things that we say we want. And, the 12plex was multiple times more than that. So these are the smallest scales that we're talking about making it happen. So anyways, you can check us out at Common Owner. It's commonowner.com, and we're one of the top products right now. And then Common Owner is in the process of merging with another crowdfunding platform called Small Change. And so as we launch here in the next couple of weeks, our actual We Can Take Your Money Now platform, there'll still be a link on commonowner.com, but smallchange.co, I believe, is the website, and you can check us out there if you got $2,500 or something that you want to go towards a duplex someplace far away from you. But we're actually offering education as a part of this. This is the other thing that we're doing, is that through building Sundial, people always ask, "How did you do this?" Right? And that's coming from people who want to be developers themselves. It's coming from people who are realtors, contractors, the YIMBY groups that we're a part of. We had open houses here. People are like, this is so cool. Like, I wish I had a place, for my mother, my boomerang child, my whatever. And so people are into it. They want to see the sustainability pieces happen. They want to see more housing diverse and happy. We had no idea if anyone was going to like even remotely think this was an interesting idea. And, $5,000 is it's a decent chunk of change to somebody, right? It's not nothing.
Yeah.
So we've been surprised, right? To see, like, again, right now we have more perfect strangers, people who we either kind of know or don't know at all. We're like, yeah, this is a great idea. And you're like, you don't know me from Joe, right? Like, you went to a building I built, maybe a tour, maybe once. Some of these people, not at all. They just went to this website. And so it speaks to something about how there is a deep seated want for the change that we're looking for, right? Like, if people are willing to like try to put $5,000 of their own money into a project of somebody they frankly barely know, right? It speaks to like how much we really would like to see things that aren't in the world yet happen, the things that we care about that we've been talking about today. And that's encouraging. That gives you hope, right? Because like that's a a really serious, it's a life-changing commitment for me, right? We hope to probably live in this structure too. That helps us make sure that we can pay off this thing and move it forward and maybe do it again one day, not anytime soon, but one day. We'll be done after this project, by the way. We're very house poor right now. Like we've got a lot of great, cool things that we've done, and yet they're set up in such a way on purpose that they will not make us a lot of money for quite a long time. The cash flows in the distant future, which is why I have to keep coming on podcasts to hawk my other work, because I got a lot of bills to pay with 3 kids under 10, but it's exciting, right?
It is exciting. Yeah.
It's enjoyable I don't know what it says about me or that my wife is a party and lets me do this too, to be at all these different angles, right? To talk about the zoning that allows these things to happen, to talk about our financial markets. And that's why it takes a community to do real estate, right? Because all these different people and all these different sort of social values and rules have to come together to reach an outcome. And speaking of things I didn't set out to do, we started out to be in the podcast, right? When I sat in an architecture office a year out of college and was, drawing all day in SketchUp, some multifamily housing buildings, I'm a risk averse person. I was perfectly happy with my headphones on, drawing 8 hours a day, as long as what I was drawing was pretty cool. And then you realize at some point that there are limitations to how cool a thing's going to be because of decisions other people are making. And that's when I realized that I wanted to try to be a part of either helping people make better decisions or changing the system that makes us make bad decisions. And here we are 20 years later. I don't know how much we've accomplished, but we've started to move that meter.
You'd be surprised, I think. I look back at what the conversations were like back in 2005. I mean, we were just trying to teach people what TOD was, and now it's like in the lexicon, right? And for you, incremental development and missing middle housing and all that stuff, I mean, that's in the lexicon. Like you said about YIMBYism and everything else, like, you don't have to beat down anybody's door anymore to make it a conversation. It's happening already. And so I know that in the line of work that we do, in architecture and planning, it looks like it takes a long time to do things, and it does. But the things that you started working on 20 years ago are now things that are actually real and have happened. And I'm always surprised at that. I'm like, well, what did we do? And I was like, oh yeah, all these things have happened, right? So yeah. I guess if we look back at it, we can say, well, what has happened? But I feel like there's a lot of things because we have changed a lot of the language, a lot of the framing about development, about cities, about how we live. And there's a whole world out there, we're all connected through the internet in some way that's talking about it, right? And it's even making, big national magazines and the New York Times and all that stuff. So not that that's like the end game or anything like that, but it's just like
the awareness.
It's a measurement of where we're at. So I'm happy about that. And we talk about 2005 a lot, but that's, my first trip to CNU was in Los Angeles. I was invited by Hank Dittmar, who was one of my professors for a class in grad school. He taught a class about TOD. He flew in from Las Vegas, New Mexico every other week for like 4 hours of class. And he's like, hey, you should come to this CNU thing. And I was like, I don't know what this is. He's like, I want you to talk to some people. And so I drove out from Texas, right? I drove out from Austin.
Right. You're still in Austin.
And I drove from Austin, and my dad was like, yeah, go to conferences, meet people, do things, like all that stuff. And so I was like, yeah. So I flew out, got a hotel on Colorado Boulevard and drove to the thing every day because I think the Gold Line was just finished, but the station was a little bit further down.
It was not quite. Yeah, I couldn't go that far. It didn't extend until long after I lived there. Yeah.
And we all got together and we had this really fun time. And I met a bunch of really cool people like you and Faith and Mike Lydon. And, look at everything that everybody's doing now. And so I know a lot of the folks that listen to the show are younger and they're looking for, their next move, or they're looking for things to do. But I always encourage people to find your people, find your crowd, find the folks that are doing the same things as you. Because in 20 years, if you meet those people, then they'll come back on your podcast and talk about all the cool stuff they're doing, right?
Do it. Yeah. No, it's funny. One of the things that came up along this process, talking about education, that was one of the things that Faith and I were talking about. We were on some road trip. Kids were asleep in the back, and we were talking about this kind of where we were at. We're thinking about where we're going to do next and so forth. And she's thinking about what she wants to do next in the world. And the difference why we went to CNU at the time was that the internet was not the internet we have now, right? To find this information, there was no other place to go, right? And that human interaction was the thing, right? Now there's books and there's internets and you can watch things on YouTube, and you can watch Dwani on YouTube 20 years ago still. Like that's the funny, not only is it there, it's like the archive, right? You can amass, if you just graduated from college, you can catch up with, the 2006 CNU lecture that's archived in some dark hole on the internet. That wasn't an option then. You read a book or two, that you found on Island Press's, website or something. But So in a way, though, the access to this information and perhaps the overwhelming amount of it actually makes it harder to learn because it's harder to figure out what's good from bad. It's harder to interact and socialize around the topics. And so absolutely. And so I think it's, especially in a post-pandemic kind of, coming back out of the social disorder that created us. If you are someone who's early in your career listening to this nostalgia action that we're having today, it is interesting. And the connections too. This industry, in any given city is a very small industry, right? And so to make these connections with people in different regions is really helpful because for better or for worse, I've made a really good living for the last 10 or 15 years, especially repeating myself from, we worked by the end of my time at IncDev, we had worked in 45 states, and trained several thousand people, right? And I wish I could say this, but it was possible to do that because we more or less had the same problems everywhere, just a slightly different flavor here or there. And so we could repeat ourselves. But the solutions, that was the key, right? We were finding different ways to tackle our local flavor of the same problem. And the question was, what could I cherry pick from Chattanooga and from South Bend and from Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I've been working a lot in the last 5 or 7 years, and meld it to something new. And that's the sort of standing joke with my new clients, right? Because I'll start working with somebody and they're like, hey, I saw this cool thing on Planet Etizen or on NPR or whatever, because it is mainstream now. Like people, like nobody saw this stuff back in the day, right? Like our clients never, like there were these hole in the wall, like newsletters. And, if they're turned on to the Jeff Wood Daily Dose, that was like, that's the only way to find it. Thank God that Jeff Woods is still here doing it, because how would we know? And so, but it's crazy now because like random people like I interact with see this information, right? That's definitely the level of awareness change. And so my clients now, have a slightly better thought process about this when they start. They have a lot of better idea what their wants are, even if they don't know how to get to it. And so the funny part is that they're not able to like say what they want, but they have a thought process about it. And so that's the joke is like, well, let's look at this case study. Let's look at this case study. Let's look at this. Let's see how, and that's the part I love to talk about. I have some of this up on my website now at Electric Housing. There's got to be more intern time. I need some more help with it. I got to write some things. The writing things is the worst possible thing. Like I have all these cool stories. I'm so glad we're doing a podcast and not like a blog post because I can't, it takes 10 times as long. But that's the cool thing about this learning, right? And that's what I start with a new client. Say, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to, I have a great new client in Denton, Texas. And they're standing up a development arm in a nonprofit that has a rental portfolio of, 100 units, but they've not done any new construction or any new development really themselves at all. And so they're having to learn every single step of how to do that. And so I said, okay, well, let's go look at the pre-approved plans that we helped create in South Bend. And let's talk about the zoning reforms that are going on in Kalamazoo that I'm helping with. Let's talk about, the 180 units of housing that's Chattanooga Neighborhood Enterprise built in over a 5-7 year period on infill lots on the east side of downtown. Like there are these awesome things that I've had a chance to work on. And yet it's not a translated solution, right? It's like, well, we're going to take a little of this, a little of that, a little of this. And, we're going to take 20% Chattanooga and mix it with 40%. Like I'm a bartender now. I think I'm just like, we're going to take some, some bitters and a splash of soda. Right. And we have a new cocktail, but that's functionally what it takes to do real estate. Right. And that's the recipe. You have to find a new recipe every time. So it's been exciting to kind of be able to interact with people in that way. And so I encourage people to do that because I think we got stuck in our rooms quite forcibly for a number of years. And we were just joking right before we started recording about like, I just stopped going to conferences between children and pandemics and so forth. And I'm like, I've been a hermit just doing my thing. And so it's good to get out and see what everyone else has been up to. The conversations you can't find out through Instagram. Right. There's only so many blog posts and photos that you can make, and it doesn't get to the real story. And that's what I'm always trying to find out. I'm always trying to find out what the real story is. So it's fun to maybe get back on the circuit here and chit chat a bit.
Yeah, it's great. So Jim, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
Yeah. Do I wish to be found? That's a good question. One of these three companies, most likely, most people are going to be interested in things at thesundialbuilding.com. That's the 12plex website. Got a bunch of cool diagrams. Shout out to my awesome part-time collaborator, Maggie Hawley, who's been putting together all these cool diagrams of our sustainability. And if you want to see how the building came together with these three-dimensional SketchUp images, you can see how the cool things we're doing with the 12plex. And then electrichousing.com is our sustainability and real estate consulting outfit. And there's information about some of the things I talked about today with our work in Kalamazoo and South Bend and other places. And then last definite pitch, we are at Neighborhood Evolution. My partners there, Bernice Radel and Mike Keene and Monty Anderson, just finished up. Actually, yesterday, we wrapped on a collaboration we're doing with Strong Towns, a video series it's going to be a 3-hour video course that'll be open later this summer, actually. They'll be editing here the next couple of months about the 12 steps of town making. And that's our process to help people. You asked about education. That's our initial foray to help orient people to, if you want to do this in your town, whether you want to be a developer or not, town making is not just being a developer. Town making is the collaborative process of all the people who are involved. And so we are putting out a new workbook, the 12 steps of town making, and you can bring us to your town if you're interested in creating an ecosystem. That's really what this is about. The 12 steps is about making an ecosystem of people. We have meetup groups in a handful of cities right now who meet monthly to go through the steps one by one, right? So they take one step each month, or sometimes they speed it up, do 2 steps a month, and talk through as a place, as a community. Hey, what can we do on this step to create a better place to build cool stuff in our cities? And so that's coming out here soon. We'll have the workbook out here later in May, and you can check out either at Strong Towns or our website, neighborhoodevolution.com, that educational series in video and in writing.
Awesome. Well, Jim, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
It's been fantastic. I'm so glad we figured out finally we should do this. And we should make it 5 years for the next time, probably next go around.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.